good day, and welcome to my class, Science Grade 4. So I'm here to teach you today. And we will discover the special properties of materials and the changes that happen when they are exposed to certain conditions. We will learn also how to classify materials based on their ability to absorb water, to float on water, to sink on water, and materials that undergo decay. Now, let us examine these materials in front of me on top of the table. Let us name them one by one. Let's start at the top. Tissue. Next, towel. Next, wooden shovel. Next, sponge. Next, frying pan. First, I have here manual or paper. Also, a drinking jar made of plastic. Spoon and fork utensil made of metal. Scissor, combination of metal and plastic. Cell phone cover made of plastic also. And this t-shirt made of cotton and fiber. Since we have determined each of these materials, now what can you notice? And how can we classify them? What are the materials that are able to absorb water? Can this tissue able to absorb water? Yes. Is this wooden shovel able to absorb water? In time? Yes. Is this t-shirt made of cotton is able to absorb water? Yes, of course. What about this plastic cover of the cell phone? Is it able to absorb water? No. What about this spoon and fork? Are they able to absorb water? So no. What about this scissor? Is this able to absorb water? No. What about this drinking jar? Is this able to absorb water? No. What about this manual or paper? Is this able to absorb water? No also. What about this sponge? Is this able to absorb water? Or this manual, of course it's able to absorb water. Correct me with that. Sponge able to absorb water. And pan is not able to absorb water. Now that we have learned each of these materials, we're going to organize. We're going to classify them. We're going to separate them. Materials that is able to absorb water and materials that are not able to absorb water. Let us group them. At this area, we will place all the materials that is able to absorb water. And at this area, we will place materials that are not able to absorb water. Let's do it. Materials that are able to absorb water will be placed at this area, while materials that are able to absorb water, we will place them at this portion. Do it. So, tissue, able to absorb water. Towel, able to absorb water, we will not move it. Or we will not transfer it because this portion are those materials that are able to absorb materials. Is this sponge able to absorb water? Yes. And this manual or paper, able to absorb water, place it in here. While this pan is not able to absorb water, place it in here. As well as this drinking jar, scissor, and spoon and fork made of metal. Is it able to absorb water? No. So place it in here. What about this plastic cover of this cell phone? Is this able to absorb water? So no. What about this clapping? Is this able to absorb water? Where we are going to place it? Okay, good. Here are the materials that are able to absorb water. Now, since we have named them one by one, and we have grouped them according to its materials, these materials are able to absorb water. These materials are not able to absorb water. Now, what do you think the reason why these materials are not able to absorb water? And why these materials able or not able to absorb water? First, these materials are able to absorb water is called porosity, is the property of the materials that are able to absorb water. Porosity is the property of materials that are able to absorb water. And this group are non-porous materials. Porous materials are materials that have holes or space between their particles. That's why they are able to absorb water. While non-porous materials has no space between their particles or in their pores, therefore, they don't have the ability to absorb water. That's why they are non-porous materials. Porous materials are materials that are able to absorb water. Non-porous materials are materials or objects that are not able to absorb water. Now that we have classified them and we have named them one by one, let us notice some materials are easily undergo decay. Why? Because of the presence of water. For example, this tissue is able and will decay in time because of the presence of water or moist in its material. That causes degradation. Degradation is the process wherein the moist or water that are absorbed by this object causes an object to decay. because of the presence of microorganisms that harbors or stay up in this material. However, materials like plastic, spoon made of metal, or porcelain, or cup, or this plastic are not able to absorb materials and do not decay immediately. So it has a process. These materials, porous materials, undergo an easily decaying stage, while these non-porous materials, some of them takes time, a decade or century before it's finally decayed. However, like tissue, it undergoes easily, quickly decaying stage. Now, that we know, that we have learned, according to its classification, porous materials, non-porous materials or object, easily decaying object, or hard or difficult time or takes a long time before decaying object. Let us now learn, why do some objects float on water? What is the reason why some objects like paper or plastic, as we will compare, do not float or float on water? So, the ability of materials to sink beneath the water, underneath the water, or float over the water depends on the density. Depends on the density of its object. What is density? Density is the amount of mass of an object per unit volume. The water has a density of 1 gram over cubic centimeter. If the density of an object is higher than the density of water, the object will sink. Again, if an object has higher density than the water, it will sink. Like for example, these porous materials and non-porous materials, we will classify them if they are able to float or sink on water. Tissue, can this object float or sink in water? If your answer is no, at the moment it will float, but it will easily absorb water because it's porous. The particles between these materials has pores or space. For a while, it will sink, or for a while, it will float, but easily it will sink on water. As it absorbs water in between its particles, the tissue gets heavier, the density becomes heavy, therefore, it will sink. Like towel also, Because of its fiber or cotton, there are pores or holes in between its particle. For a while, it will float on water, but easily, as it absorbs water, it becomes heavy. The density of this object that absorbs water becomes heavy, then this object, the towel, will sink under the water. Wooden shovel. For a while, it will float, but if it gets heavy and the water fill in its pores, it will sink. But it takes time. So it depends on time. When this object, porous materials, float or sink in water. So the lighter the materials, as we have noticed, like tissue or paper, or the larger the space between its pores, between its fabric, the object sinks quickly because the density becomes higher than the density of water, which is 1 gram over cubic centimeter. Now let's move on to non-porous materials. Plastic cover of the cell phone. Is this object able to sink or float? So, it will float. It depends on its situation. But this object permanently float or sink, it depends. For a while, it will float, but eventually, as the water pours in, this object becomes heavy than the density of the water, then this object will sink. While this utensil, spoon and fork, is made of metal, it's heavy than the density of the water, therefore it will sink quickly under the water. As well as this scissor, because its density is higher than the density of water, it will easily sink under the water. Now this jar of water, is this able to sink on water or float on water? If your answer is float on water, then you are right, because it's sealed on top. The water will not go inside the jar. Therefore, the density of this jar is lesser than the density of water. Therefore, it will float. But it becomes heavier when the water fills inside the jar. When it gets heavy, then it will sink. But if it is tightly closed, this object will not sink in water. Now this frying pan, non-porous material, is able to sink in water or float on water. Again, temporarily, if it plays on water like this, then temporarily it will float. But eventually, as the water pours in, it gets heavy, or the pan will be placed diagonally, so the mass of this object becomes heavier, then it will sink. So that's it for our lesson about special properties of materials. We have learned and we have classified materials that are able to absorb water are materials that have pores or space between its particles. Therefore, there are porous materials. while non-porous materials are materials that does not have space between its particle. It's non-porous. We have learned also that some materials easily decay and some materials are not. And lastly, we have learned today that some materials are easily sink in water and some materials does not sink in water. So that's it for today for our lesson. Thank you for watching this video. For your comment, for your suggestion, feel free to chat your idea. So thank you and have a great day. Happy learning.